My father died just about a month ago now, and this video is my occasion to talk about the crossroads in my life when I decided to change my own legal name, and talk a little bit about the fact that I knew my father, that I really knew and understood who he was, because very, very few people alive on this earth did. It's not so much a video about my father himself. Is that because I'm censoring myself? I really made an aesthetic decision when I started this channel, aesthetic rather than ethical or moral, that this channel was for me to tell my story and not to tell my parents' story, not to tell my ex-wife's story, not to tell anyone else's story other than mine. And I still do feel, both aesthetically and morally, that in many ways his story is not mine to tell. Now, my relationship with my father was dramatic. We had our differences. But, you know, first and foremost, I got to say, I really did know the man. I did appreciate the man. I appreciated the good things and bad about him. I understood how his mind works. And I had a huge advantage over all my other brothers and sisters because I stayed at home all the way through high school and all the way through university. Now, during university, I didn't eat meals with him 3 times a day. I would talk to him a couple times a week. But still, that meant that during the adult years of my life, I was talking to him several times a week, man to man, as 2 adults. And during those years, he really did talk to me as an equal. And we talked about history and politics and his philosophy of life and his view of the world and his business and his views on the arts, what have you. And I mean, it is a real credit to him that he could basically set aside the fact that I was his biological son and talk to me as a friend. And during those years, he did talk to me as a friend, as an equal, as another adult. I don't have a whole lot of compliments to give him in this video, but that is one. And both of us benefited from it. During those years, my father did not have many friends. He may have had 1 or 2 in distant parts of the world who he talked to once in a while. But in many ways, he was alone, and he needed that friendship also. Now, the contrast for me is I have so many brothers and sisters. My father had 9 children with quite a number of different mothers to those children. And in general, all of my blood relatives, whether they're brothers, sisters, cousins, aunts and uncles, what have you, they really seem to view my father as a myth rather than a man. I was talking to one of my brothers once, and he said to me that my father could have been a great poet if only he had chosen another woman to be his wife. My brother had this fantastic narrative in his head about how my father was, you know, really in his soul a poet and painter and artist and political extremist. Don't forget that. But that my father had made a terrible mistake in choosing my biological mother to be his next wife, and that only when he turned this corner, when he changed paths, then he gave up all his dreams and aspirations to be a poet and threw away his bright future as, you know, whatever, one of the greatest poets in Canada or something. Yeah, grandiose though my father's opinion of himself may have been, he would have never once claimed that he could have paid the rent with his poetry, that he could have made that his exclusive, you know, career or means of income. And, you know, he could have chosen to spend more time writing poetry, especially in his old age, obviously. He could have published more books of poetry. And his poems are not all bad. But what struck me about this example was my brother was really deeply indulging in this myth-making mentality about my father, both in regarding him as hero and villain. Most of the people who knew him, that was really how they saw him and thought about him, as a larger-than-life hero and a smaller-than-life villain, and never really just appreciated him for the man he was, all in all. And I turned to my brother and said to him simply, "Oh, yeah, you know, his poems. Have you read them? Like, have you read the books of poetry he actually published?" My brother looked at me astonished. As if it had never entered his mind to actually get the book out of the library. And he said to me, "No, have you?" I said, "Yeah, you know." And again, I can say good and bad, but he had a few good poems in there. Now that he's deceased, I'm actually asking my mom, maybe I can get a copy of that book, one of the books of poetry that I'm thinking of in particular, and hold on to it as a memento of my father. I remember once as a school project, I actually memorized and read aloud one of the poems, because I think the school project was to memorize and read one poem from any published Canadian poet. So I chose my own father as the published Canadian poet. It was a good poem. I know. But in this way, I've said this to my father directly in the last few years. I've said it several times. I said to him, look, I'm not like your other sons and daughters. I don't think of you as a great author. I don't think of you as a great businessman. I don't think of you as a great political figure. I don't think of you as a great poet or a great painter or a great artist. You know, I think of you as the guy who fell asleep on the couch watching baseball. I think of you for the man you really are, not for who you pretend to be, and not for any of the larger-than-life roles, hero or villain, what have you, that other people kind of project onto you or ascribe to you, the roles they expect you to play. And I think he did appreciate that about me, that I was maybe the only person in his life who really talked to him man to man and who knew who I was talking to. And I knew when he was lying to me. You know, I could tell, that kind of thing. I could read him like a book. Most people never figured out, but I figured it out. You know, I think he did appreciate that. But on the whole, it's obvious that he enjoyed the other game more. I think he enjoyed rather more changing hats and having different people who regarded him as the hero, as the villain, as the poet, as the political extremist, or as the businessman. Because in his career, very often, he really just literally put on a different hat, and he had people who regarded him in a totally different way, in a totally different context. He just stood around talking to architects and businessmen and what have you, and bureaucrats. And there's another side of his life where they didn't know at all. I mean, apparently nobody uses Google. They didn't even look up the books he'd published, which did indeed include both poetry and political extremism. So look, I mean, so far I'm smiling and laughing a lot. You know, nobody wants to speak ill of the dead. It is true, though, that there was a kind of traumatic turning point in my life, which is when I changed my legal name. Now, it's interesting. I do not think of it as a negative thing in my life. I don't associate it with, well, let's stick with the same word. I don't think of it as a trauma. I think of it as kind of a joyful, wonderful thing that I turned this corner and changed my legal name and took on this new direction. Although things did not turn out quite as planned. I mean, I can talk about it kind of before, after, and during when the decision was made and how the outcomes were a little bit unexpected for me. I mean, in some ways, my change of name, it relates negatively to my father's legacy. And in some ways, it really positively reflects the upbringing I had. And he could recognize that also. So I grew up very much being immersed in the world of modern art, of painters and art galleries and art history, and a very politicized view of the significance of modern art, because that was my father's own taste. And the art world, even more than the world of, say, science fiction writers or poets or philosophers, is indeed full of people who adopt a nom de plume or a nom-de-guerre, who use, you know, an outrageous second name, who adopt a different identity in their role as creator, author, or artist. So actually, in the months prior to my making the decision to change my legal name, I was already thinking about that really seriously for quite a number of reasons. And it's interesting. If I had done it then, if I'd done it just a few months earlier, then the whole way it would have been presented to my parents, the significance of it within the family might have been quite different. And they did accept it in that same way, too. They did say, okay, they recognized. There were other people in the family who had adopted, you know, different names to live under as authors, or in one case as an athlete, actually. I have one uncle who was a professional boxer. And he made his name as a boxer his legal name also, so he didn't have to have the name he was born and raised with. But it is true that at the particular time when this happened, I had already, you know, during those years, my university, I thought I knew everything, good, bad, and ugly, about my father already. And there was a lot of bad, and there was a lot of ugly. And I thought we had gotten to the point in our relationship where I knew he would lie to me because he lied all the time. He lied to everyone. So I say, most people never really knew the man. They really did not know who he was. I mean, whatever it was he thought about him, the reality is he was a kid who grew up playing baseball, and he would have never gone to university and never would have dreamed of having the career he had if only he could have made it into the lowest level of, AAA sandlot baseball. That was his passion in life. Don't let him tell you otherwise. Sure, he took on other passions, but, it's real easy to misrepresent who he was and what he was about. And he delighted in that. He delighted in the misrepresentation and in looking in the twisted mirror, the funhouse mirror of how other people perceived and misperceived him. That was a delight all his life, from his teenage years to his dying days. I don't know if he loved to deceive others so much as he loved the feeling of being deceived himself. But to be caught up in a story and to be a protagonist in a story was much more important to him than any sense of honesty, integrity, or authenticity. Things he was in his way fascinated with, but severely lacking in. Anyway, look, I got to a point with my father where I thought I knew all the dirt that obviously when I was a child had been hidden under a rug. And there I was. I'd basically finished university, but university had not actually issued my diploma yet. So bureaucratic reasons, basically. There's this considerable delay between when I really finished my university courses and I hadn't actually graduated on paper yet, hadn't had it issued as graduated. During that time, there were shocking revelations about other things in his life that really did impact my life that had been kept a secret from me and that he had been lying to me about, even that year. So he had never admitted to me how many brothers and sisters I had. This is only the tip of the iceberg. It was a long, sordid story, a whole bunch of revelations. And again, I was just praising him before for the extent to which he had spoken to me as a friend, man to man, as equals, for years. So, although there might have been some justification or some excuse, if I found this out when I was 12 years old, they might have said, well, come on, how could we have told you this stuff, this shocking, horrible, sordid stuff, these secrets out of our life, when you were 8? How could we have told you any earlier? Right. But this is at the end of my university diploma, when I wasn't just a fully grown adult, but we've been spending a lot of quality time together as fully grown adults. And again, I knew him. I didn't have any kind of hero worship of him. I didn't idolize him. During those years, I regarded him as a deeply flawed character. I knew about some tremendously immoral and unethical things he both did and just things he believed and preached, in the abstract, but that I considered utterly unforgivable. But, we could get along. We were copacetic, put it that way, in those years. We had these unbelievable revelations, and included among them several brothers and sisters, the existence of which I had never heard of before. And still to this day, he went to his grave. You'll note, if you look up his obituary, everyone else's obituary says something like proud father of 3 children, or father, proud father of 2 sons or something. His obituary does not mention how many sons and daughters he had. He lived his whole life that way, even with me, of not admitting that. And he went to his grave. His obituary still does not admit how many sons and daughters he had. What a guy. Anyway, at that point, it was interesting because my own thoughts about adopting a new name formerly were really attached, first and foremost, to what I saw as my own role as an author in the future. That would be a whole different video. I could talk about it now. It would be really lengthy. What books I was planning on writing at the time, what role I saw for myself as an author in the future. But I did think, look, publishing under my name, this is going to be a big part of my life. How am I going to approach that now that I'm finishing university? And at that time, I had very specific plans to pursue a career path quite separate from my research and humanitarian work. So in many ways, I had a very clear vision of myself becoming an author and what kind of research I wanted to do. But I was going to do that outside of academia, which to some extent has remained the case. I did already at that time. I had my eyes on Cambodia. I had my eyes on a certain kind of humanitarian work, a certain kind of, social, political research, and research linked to Buddhism. A lot of those interests were already in place. But then how I was going to approach that, how I was going to write about that, and who I was going to be, what the name was in the piece of paper, those were questions I really had to ask myself. And already before those revelations, I was thinking, I had a heavy heart. Every time I signed the name that he gave me, it was really loaded. It was really something negative for me to look at. In part because it was linked to him, in part because it was linked to a particular political meaning that the name had, both the first name and the last name. And then after the shocking revelations happened, all of that was made dramatically worse. Because now all of a sudden I looked at this name, and it was attached to a real sense of shame, much greater than I'd felt before. A real sense of revulsion for, shame for the family I came from, and for who my father was. And again, it's to his credit. This wasn't a secret. I mean, I talked about this with him, man to man, without either one of us screaming or throwing a book across the room. Maybe being a bit, I mean, that's true, but it's a bit flattering. This is not to say that his responses were entirely, philosophical. I remember one conversation he and I had where he did break down crying, which is totally understandable. If anything, makes him more human. And then when we talked about it years later, he has this habit of mind. He absolutely insisted he could not admit that he had broke down crying in front of me. That was a strange, sad, and immature thing. And I'll just digress from that narrative for a moment. At one point, I took my father aside because my mother complained to me. She said, look, your father, he started drinking ouzo. Ouzo is a type of liqueur, a type of alcohol. It tastes like anise. It's terrible. You have to talk him out of it. They would go to these parties and social events and business meetings and so on, and they would be meeting with refined and highly educated people. And my father had started ordering ouzo as his drink of choice at these events. And this was simply regarded as unsophisticated. This was regarded as a drink for frat boys, not something becoming of an elderly, refined gentleman. Sheer snobbery. But my father had started drinking ouzo, and my mother appealed to me. She implored me. She said, look, you got to take this up because this is messing up our social calendar and possibly negatively impacting our business. Okay, so I took him aside, and again, I'm a fully grown adult here. I had already quit drinking for many years, but I knew about alcohol. And I said, look, I'm going to break this down for you. This over here is ouzo. This over here is pastis. Do you want to know what the difference is? The difference is the cultural perception of you and what kind of guy you are when you drink one rather than the other. It was a long conversation, and I poured him, some shots, and he tasted them, and I explained to him. At that time, I knew where pastis came from and how it was made, and and he learned. He adopted it. So we had this bizarre meeting to discuss his drinking habits, and I explained to him why he had to upgrade from ouzo to pastis. Now, after that, we didn't talk. It felt like 2 years, but maybe it was a year and a half or something. I forget. We didn't talk for quite a while. I didn't see him. We didn't see each other for quite a while. And then I saw him again under strange circumstances. And we were standing at the same table where we had the earlier conversation, whatever it was, a year earlier, what have you. And at exactly the same table, he was pouring himself pastis. And I said to him as a joke, I said, oh, so I see you're not drinking ouzo anymore, because this was obviously my influence from the earlier conversation. And he looked at me, and we're standing there face to face, and he categorically denied, he refused that I had ever talked to him about this, that this was something, and he told me the same story, the same narrative, as if this was something he had invented himself that he and I had never talked about. He was basically telling me the same information about pastis and the difference from ouzo and why he drinks pastis rather than ouzo, as if I had never heard it before. I kept saying to him, I told you this. This is like I taught you. This was a memorable father-son moment in our lives. Why are you doing this? Why are you lying to me? And you couldn't get him to shake out of it. Maybe 10 years after that, we talked about the same episode again. Because I was raising him not to beat him over the head with it, not to, emotionally, manipulate him or anything. But I was saying to him, look, you need to understand, you don't tell lies the same way other people do. Most people lie to you when they have a clear ulterior motive. They're trying to conceal something, or they're trying to affect an outcome or manipulate you to do something. I said to him, your problem is you lie all the time, and you don't have it under control. And you can't stop, even when I can see it in your eyes that you do remember. He didn't have a bad memory. I think he had a remarkably good memory. You know, when I was saying that to him, you remember, I taught you this. And you can see it in his eyes. He knows it's true. He knows he's lying, but he just can't stop. So he was a mythomaniac, I would say. I mean, these are small and harmless examples, but the vast majority of people did not understand the way his mind worked. They did not know who he was as a man. And so all kinds of acrimony and misunderstandings and mutual hatred grew out of it, because sometimes he was doing things that really hurt other people, hurt their feelings, or negatively impacted their lives, and he felt no sense of responsibility, and he didn't even know he was doing it. And that's not to exculpate him. I mean, I myself was in situations where he made decisions that had terrible, terrible impacts on my life. And, you know, you could spend years trying to explain to him, you made this decision, you did this thing, here were the consequences for me. It was very, very hard to get him to take responsibility, or just to admit that he said that or he did that. But he did sometimes. I mean, if you spent 10 years, there were some examples where 10 years later he apologized to me for something after I'd explained it to him 5 times. So, I mean, you know, he had a human heart. He had, you know, he was not lacking in the normal human sentiments and emotions. And he did love me. He really did. And he did appreciate me. And whether that was in the level of asking my advice or opinion about things when he really appreciated my opinion, or in a more, you know, sentimental, conventional sense of father to son. You know, during the last years of his life, he was reading the essays I was writing about history and politics when I was at University of Victoria. And he had appreciation for that, and he had appreciation for the man I became. I mean, above all else, I mean, he had appreciation for the fact that I was able to do a lot of things that he was not able to do. A major turning point in his life, you know, was that when he was quite young, he decided to learn Sanskrit when he finished his BA. And he couldn't do it. Making a long story short here. But even being in a university where he had access to dictionaries and textbooks and a professor to teach him and help him and so on, a professor and a tutor, he could not do Sanskrit 101. He couldn't learn the basics of Sanskrit. And I, by contrast, taught myself Pali, the ancient canonical language of Theravada Buddhism, an ancient Indian language cognate with Sanskrit, very similar to Sanskrit. I taught myself Pali with no textbook and no teacher and no university, while simultaneously learning to speak Laotian and doing humanitarian work and living in very rough third world conditions in Laos. So, you know, he got to see with time, you know, he got to see just how sharp I was. He got to see how sharp I was because he saw me doing the cutting, put it that way. So there were ways in which I can say we had positive relations. But he knew that my decision to change my name at the time that it happened, it really did reflect a lot of sorrow and agony. You know, that was his fault, in brief. And look, there are many, many ways in which I feel very positively about my change of name. And when I've talked to other people who come from, shall we say, a troubled family background, I've often suggested to them that they should do it also. To me, it was tremendously positive and liberating that whenever I signed a check at the bank or signed government paperwork, I didn't have to look at that name. I didn't have to be attached to that family. I didn't have to be reminded of who my father was and what he did, and those particularly terrible revelations or what have you, you know, or all the unforgivable things, you know, my parents did to me that we tried to address. And, you know, I've moved past. I have gone on with my life. I'm not psychologically burdened with them anymore. But that had terrible, terrible impacts in my life for many, many years, you know. For me, it's actually a really positive and joyful thing. Now, on the other hand, I was not planning in Toronto to live under that name. At the time I made the change, I did think of it as being like many of the modern painters, modern poets, modern authors, who, had a name they published under, the name they used when they published books, what have you. But they didn't expect their own mother to use that name. They didn't expect their grandmother to use that name. Or I assume the social circle of people who went to primary school with them, they didn't call them by that name either. And there were a lot of ways in which, elements of my channel, I was talking about this with a friend of mine a few days ago, are really still kind of painterly. And that really is the education my father provided me with in modern art. The fact that this channel is named à-bas-le-ciel is really very painterly. The fact that my name is Eisel Mazard, and if you Google it, find out where that name comes from and what it really is, that also is really very painterly. And it connects to, for me, I'd say above all else, Dadaism, the Dadaist period, more than surrealist or modern abstract expressionist or what have you. But, across the board, there is this kind of reckless creative sense of picking out such an arbitrary and provocative name and making it work for you as an author, as a creative person. But, I didn't have the other steps in my life planned. What ended up happening was, on the one hand, against my wishes, because I told my parents explicitly, I don't expect you to call me this name. I don't expect my grandmother to call me this name. And I'm not going to live under it here in Toronto. And psychologically, I don't know why, they did the opposite. They forced me to do exactly that. They went to my grandmother and spoke to her. They decided to force me to transition to using that name all the time, everywhere in Toronto. And I'll never get an explanation from them, because that was the exact opposite of my intention. I thought this would be the name I publish monographs under, but that I wasn't going to use it face-to-face to people in my life, especially not them. And, I ended up leaving Toronto, and not just geographically. Suddenly, the way my life turned out, living in Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Taiwan, all these other places, I lost all contact with the people who had known me by the name that my father gave me, the name I was born to. So my nom-de-guerre became the only name I lived under, aside from the fact that it then had Asian names on top of it. So like in Laos, some people called me Sang Phuc. Actually in the office in Laos, I was called I Saw and I Son, two variations of the same nickname. Here in China, I'm Da Ying and so on and so forth. I had names in Asian languages. Oh yeah, in Cambodia, I was Isarak. So, I had another layer of pseudonyms, so to speak, on top of my legal name everywhere I lived and everywhere I went, which is also very interesting. But all the people who knew me personally, girlfriends, but also just friends, they all knew that about my family background. They knew that I had a biological family, but I had broken from them and adopted a different name. And, it really just depended on their level of interest and what seemed appropriate, how much they'd want to know about the reasons for that. But yeah, overall, when the the simple fact of my legal name change was shared on YouTube, it amused the hell out of me to see different people latching onto it and constructing different stories about it, and wild conspiracy theories and what have you. And to me, I thought, great, that's just what a name exists for. The story grows in the telling. Because for me also, all these decisions, like, the decision I made to move to Laos when I did, in some ways that was a really sorrowful decision. I could talk about, sad aspects of that. And it was, having to face up to some of my dreams in life seemed to be impossible. Career aspirations and educational aspirations, and having to face up the fact that in a Canadian university, there was no way I could study the things I wanted to study. Well, what do you want to do? Do you want to go back and get a master's degree that you hate in a subject you have contempt for, with a professor you don't respect, studying something you don't want to study, in the wrong language, what I mean? And it still doesn't lead to a job, and maybe leads to you to be in debt or what have you. Do you want to go back and mope through that every day? Or do you want to make a bold break from your current circumstances? go up and live on the Mekong River. I can still remember the first time I saw the Mekong and the magical sense you had. Because just in my mind, it was something I would never live to see. And here I was living every day on the banks of the Mekong River and try to find your own way. Oh, you don't have a textbook for Pali? Write your own textbook. You don't have a teacher for Pali? Take the appendix out of the textbook. Memorize every single word in the appendix. Do your own thing. Make your own fortune. You know, that same sense of being bold and creative and finding your own way. That's an aspect of my character that's there in that name too, you know. So for me, it's something really positive. And even the connection to my father, as much as the change of name is linked to unspeakable things that still in this video I'm not really going to talk about connecting to my father, it's also connected to a positive memory of my father, what he loved about the arts, and the role of the artist in society, including taking on a new name, taking on a new direction, and not just challenging social expectations, but I guess we could say challenging your expectations of yourself.